Hey everybody, I want to share a little bit today about the spiritual practice or spiritual discipline of fasting and how that was done by John Wesley and the early Methodists and how that connects back with the traditions of the Church of England and the early church. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about in this video. There's a lot that we could say about fasting and why we fast and the spiritual benefits of fasting. We could talk a lot about emptying ourselves in order to be filled with God, with grace. We could talk about mortifying our flesh and trying to put our physical desires and appetites in submission to our rational part, as it were, or our soul and the Word of God. We could talk about trying to draw near to the suffering servant, Jesus Christ. I mean, there's a lot that you could say about spiritually why we fast and what's going on in fasting. And if you want to do some more reading on fasting, I've talked about both of these books on this channel. I've done a video on each one of them, but they're really good ones to look at. One, particularly if you're curious about how Wesley and the early Methodists approached some of this, is this book, Eight. Oh, can you see it? Eight Life Enriching Practices of United Methodists by Henry H. Knight III, which is a good little book. And then a really great book, Celebration of Discipline by Richard J. Foster. It has an amazing chapter on fasting. And I remember when I was in college, I met somebody who was fasting because they were preparing to make a big decision or something like that. And it was like, people do that? Like, it's not Bible times anymore, and here's somebody who's really doing it. It was like I had been going to church multiple times a week for years, and it never occurred to me that people fast. And so it's a spiritual discipline that maybe is neglected in some quarters of the church or evangelicalism, which is where I was. But certainly, Jesus fasted, as we read about at the beginning of Lent every year, and he presumed that his apostles and his disciples were going to continue this very Jewish tradition of fasting, which you also see Moses and Elijah and others in the Old Testament doing. And so in Matthew chapter 6 and in verse 16, Jesus gives instructions about not making a big show about your fasting or any of your spiritual disciplines, but he says, whenever you fast, just assuming that, of course, that's something that followers of Jesus are going to do. So I want to talk a little bit about how the early Methodists did that and kind of what that looked like. And Richard Foster's book, I will say, Celebration of Discipline, that chapter has some great practical advice about like what to eat before you fast, what kinds of things to eat to break your fast. You don't want to just go pig out at a all-you-can-eat, pizza buffet. Some of us have done. But he talks about kind of how to do it in a healthy way, what to expect from your body, what kind of aches and pains, and how long some of that lasts, and so on. So really great stuff in that chapter, born out of his own experience. But what John Wesley and the early Methodists did, and part of the reason they got the name Methodist, is they were methodical in using the spiritual disciplines, the spiritual practices, what we call the means of grace, things like prayer, Bible study, receiving the sacraments, worship and fasting, and gathering in small groups with other Christians for encouragement and prayer and confession and accountability as well. They did all these things in order to open themselves to receive more and more and more of God's grace, to change their lives, to become more holy, more like Jesus. That's why we call them the means of grace. And what Wesley and the early Methodists did was to have weekly fasting. And so I think I'll work backward and you can kind of see how this works. John Wesley originally insisted that he certainly and other Methodists and particularly Methodist preachers should fast every Wednesday and every Friday. So 2 days a week they should fast basically every week. And if they were physically able to do it. John Wesley was acquainted with someone who was sickly and ill and actually died after a long period of fasting, and there's kind of a cautionary tale there. If you're physically able to do it, twice a week is what was expected of the Methodists and the Methodist preachers, and particularly Wednesdays and Fridays. And so it'd be like a 24-hour fast. You skip breakfast, you skip lunch, and then you go from dinner yesterday to dinner today kind of thing. Um, so as Wesley got older, as the movement got bigger, and they kind of backed it down. I don't know if you'd say they watered it down because it's still fairly rigorous to just fasting from food, typically every Friday of the year. And when John Wesley took the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican Prayerbook, and revised it for the early Methodists, you get John Wesley's Book of Common Prayer. It's called the Sunday Service of the Methodists in North America. This is a fairly recent reprint of it. He includes in the front a calendar which kind of lists some of the major holidays. And like a lot of the calendar especially, and I've done another video about this, he took the English prayer book and he cut things out to simplify things. And he simplified the calendar a lot. But he still included in the Christian year, in the Christian calendar, days of fasting or abstinence all Fridays of the year except Christmas Day if it falls on a Friday. So every Friday of the year, unless it's a feast day, and the only one would be Christmas if it falls on a Friday, are days of fasting or abstinence. Now, in the Common Prayer Book that he adapted that from, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, this is the Common Prayer Book that John Wesley loved. He says, I know of no liturgy in ancient or modern language that breathes more of a solid, rational, scriptural piety than the Common Prayer of the Church of England. That's why the worship book he gave to the early Methodists is basically a light revision of the prayer book, because he loved it. And in the Book of Common Prayer, there is calendars and scripture lessons for the Christian year. And it says, it lists the days of fasting or abstinence, the 40 days of Lent, and then the Ember Days, which happen 4 times a year, kind of toward the beginning of each of the 4 seasons. And then the Rogation Days, which are connected to specific feast days. These are all days of fasting in the Book of Common Prayer. And then all Fridays of the year except Christmas Day. So you see, John Wesley took the weekly fast on Fridays from the Common Prayer Book, and he made that part of the worship book that he gave to the early Methodists, and his recommendation for what a disciplined life of a United Methodist should look like. And or a Methodist, a Wesleyan Christian, including United Methodists and others too, Global Methodists and others that follow him. Now, I'll say, as a Methodist pastor, I haven't always done that. There have been seasons where I do it and don't do it, the weekly Friday fast, but it definitely has been a part of my spiritual life at times, and probably more needs to be more than it has been. So Wesley, as he got older, and he lived to be close to 90, and so he's getting a little bit physically weaker, he continues, even still, to do this weekly Friday fast, but he will at times back it down to what he called a half fast. And that's where he basically doesn't fast all the way until dinner time, but he breaks his fast at tea time, so like 2:33 in the afternoon maybe. He'll skip breakfast and lunch, and then break fast, have his breakfast, essentially his first food of the day, at tea time in the afternoon. And that was kind of an accommodation to his sort of aging and getting weaker. I think if you haven't fasted much, or haven't done it in a while, or maybe haven't done it ever, that might be a good way to start. It's with what Wesley calls the half fast. And just try to go till mid-afternoon, and then break your fast with a snack, a small meal, before the evening meal. So that was kind of Wesley's simplest, or you might say least rigorous version of this, but it's still, uncomfortable, and you doing it every week. It's a good spiritual practice. In both Wesley's prayer book and the original Book of Common Prayer, it says days of fasting or abstinence, and there are traditions, of course, about fasting from other things besides just all food, like especially fasting from meat, or fasting from desserts and delectable food, right? So you might just have salads or vegetable soup or something through the day instead of eating a more sumptuous meal. And that's a kind of abstinence. It's not a complete fasting from food. And that's something that the prayer book and Wesley's prayer book do recommend. Um, so in the Methodist movement, it was Wednesdays and Fridays uh, for the whole year early on, and he kind of backed it down to Friday. And that echoes what's in the Book of Common Prayer. And then it also echoes where that comes from, where the prayer book got it, and where Wesley and the early Methodists got it, was from the ancient church. So there's a document from very early called the Didache, which is just Greek for teaching. It's the teaching of the apostles is the name of the document. And this document, so far as we know, was not written by one of the apostles, but it was written sometime around the turn of the second century. So late first century, early second century. Could have been written while some of the apostles are actually still alive, or maybe within a few decades after they've all died. And so, very early document, probably a pretty good indicator of what apostolic Christianity looked like. And there's a lot of interesting things about this document. It's one of the earliest Christian documents to talk about abortion. It has prayers and traditions around the Eucharist, Holy Communion, and the way they thought about that in some interesting ways. But it also does have some instruction about just other spiritual matters, including fasting. And this is what it says. This is in section 8 of the Didache. It says, "Do not let your fasts coincide with those of the hypocrites. They fast on Monday and Thursday. So you must fast on Wednesday and Friday." And then it says, "Nor should you pray like the hypocrites. Instead, pray like this, just as the Lord commanded in his gospel." And then it has the Lord's Prayer. So, and it says, pray like this 3 times a day. So you see sort of the prayer life of the early church was the Lord's Prayer, memorize it, say it 3 times a day. And then it goes on to talk about the Eucharist. But fasting, interesting little, just short little snippet. Don't fast with the hypocrites on Mondays and Thursdays. Fast on Wednesdays and Fridays instead. And I read one commentator who said that what's going on there is that the Pharisees, or some of their disciples, were known to fast on Mondays and Thursdays. And in this community where this was written, those were like the market days. Those were the days you were going to bump into a whole lot more people. And so what the Didache is actually really getting at is kind of the idea of you're not trying to fast for other people to see and to know that you're fasting. Same thing Jesus talked about, right? In Matthew 6. You want it to be a private thing. You want it to be something between you and God. And so, and not something you make a show of, like, "Ooh, look at me, I'm fasting," because that's spiritual pride. So if that commentator is correct, that's sort of what the Didache is getting at, kind of echoing in a different way the same principle that we see with Jesus. But it does give specific days, Wednesdays and Fridays. And the reason Wednesdays and Fridays, as I understand, is Friday, of course, is the day that Jesus was crucified. It's the day that he was humbled, which is part of what fasting is about. And he suffered and was in agony, which is, in a small kind of way, part of what fasting connects us to. And then Wednesday is traditionally the day that Judas betrayed Jesus. And so, again, these pivotal moments in the passion, the betrayal, the humiliation, the death of Jesus, these are the moments, these are low moments, these are dark moments. These are the moments where the church has historically fasted. Just kind of like we worship on Sunday mornings, commemorating every single week the glory of the resurrection and the celebration of it. So fasting on these days is a way of on a weekly basis, remembering the betrayal and the passion and the death of Jesus as well. So that was the practice of the early Methodists, drawing on the ancient church's tradition that was also preserved in the Book of Common Prayer in the Church of England. And you see this a lot with Wesley. He talks a lot about going back to primitive Christianity, and that doesn't mean like unsophisticated. The way he's using the word, it just means early, like the first form of it. early Christianity, the ancient church, the early church fathers. Go back to the apostolic fathers and that early time of growth and expansion. And not that the church was perfect. Read the Bible. There's a lot of problems with the early church, but it is this time of growth and of being close to the fount, close to the apostles, close to Christ. And so Wesley's trying to get back to that in the Methodist movement and the way that it's organized and the way that it works within the Church of England, because he really wants, as he says many times, to bring revival to the church and the nation of England. So they have this practice, fasting weekly, Wednesdays and Fridays, and then later among the Methodists, just Fridays. And fasting is a great spiritual practice. Of course, many Christians will fast or have some kind of abstinence during the 40 days of Lent, during the season of Lent. But it's a great spiritual practice beyond Lent, especially in times of discernment. The church I serve is in a discernment process, and we are asking people to pray and to fast as the congregation decides what they want their future to look like in terms of their denominational connection. If they want to stay with the United Methodist Church or move to a different denomination, that's something they have to discern. And fasting is a good, anytime you're discerning, whether you're thinking about going into ordained ministry or being a missionary or marrying a particular person or taking a new job. These are all great times of discernment when fasting is a great tool to use along with prayer. Um, so seasons of discernment, seasons of preparation, that's what Lent and Advent are kind of fasting seasons to get ready for a spiritual experience. If you're going to go on a pilgrimage, you might fast, or if you're going to get married, you're going to get ordained, something like that, you might fast in preparation for these things. People do, in some traditions, fast or skip a meal before receiving Holy Communion as a kind of preparation. Let that be the first food that I eat to break this short little fast. So there are different ways that works. But the early Methodists were trying to get back to the ancient church, and that's what, of course, the Church of England and the English Reformers were trying to do as well. And that is a great old tradition of fasting on Fridays and also Wednesdays to remember the betrayal, the suffering, the death of Jesus, even as we prepare every single week to celebrate his resurrection. So a little bit about the practice of fasting and when to do it, and hopefully that's interesting for you guys. Maybe this will inspire you to try to start fasting again, or maybe for the first time, as a way of getting close to Jesus, who emptied himself all the way to be with us and to gather us up and to save us. And so, until we connect again, I pray that the Lord will bless you and keep you and fill you. Amen.